Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this briefing on the Aotearoa New Zealand Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. We're pleased to have you with us today. My name is Jess and I lead the development of the New Zealand Taxonomy on behalf of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. CSF provides the secretariat and coordination functions for the development of the New Zealand Taxonomy. I'm pleased to say that the second public consultation on the draft of the New Zealand Taxonomy for Agriculture and Forestry has just opened on the CSF website. Today, we're going to hear from some of our Agriculture and Forestry Technical Advisory Group members about the newly developed Adaptation and Resilience criteria. Then CBI Technical Expert Pip Band will walk us through in detail what the Adaptation and Resilience criteria, which are now available for consultation, look like. And then I will run through a summary of some of the major changes that were made to the mitigation criteria following the last consultation, as well as some areas of focus for this consultation feedback, and talk in some more detail about making consultation submissions. Next slide, please. But first, we're very excited to let you know that last week, the Minister of Climate Change announced the next two sectors which will be having criteria developed under the New Zealand Taxonomy. So that is the energy sector and construction and building sectors. The expressions of interest process for the energy sector tag is open now. I will provide some more information about how to apply for that at the back of this webinar, or you can find it now on the CSF website. We've had some really positive responses from these sectors and some really good enthusiasm about developing a framework that can support sustainable investment and finance for climate change mitigation, adaptation and resilience activities across both these sectors. So we are excited to get started with that work. But back to agriculture and forestry for today. So next slide, please. Just a reminder at the top of the call, a sustainable finance taxonomy is a classification system for sustainable activities in different sectors. Many financial institutions have their own internal taxonomies, but by having an open source taxonomy, we have clear, transparent, and highly credible criteria available to any decision makers who may want to use it. The purpose of the New Zealand Taxonomy is to direct and mobilise capital towards sustainable activities, that is, activities that align to a net zero future and that restore nature. The theory of change being that by reducing the cost and friction and risks associated with assessing sustainability credentials of activities, it aids capital to flow here. In New Zealand, our work has started with developing definitions and criteria for the objectives of climate change mitigation and adaptation and resilience for the agriculture and forestry sectors. Next slide, please. An important reminder that, of course, the New Zealand Taxonomy is a voluntary framework for both the sectors being classified and for the financial institutions. So it provides decision useful information by setting these clear criteria for what effective climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience activities look like, but it is at the discretion of any business owner or operator if they wish to undertake any of these activities. And likewise, it is at the discretion of any financial institution or investor if they wish to use this information in capital allocation decisions. Next slide, please. We're very pleased that the new draft of the NZ Taxonomy that's now open for consultation now includes criteria for classifying activities that contribute to climate change adaptation and resilience. These drafted criteria are the major focus of our second public consultation. As New Zealand increasingly experiences extreme weather events and the impacts of changing temperatures on ecosystems, the need for adaptation and resilience building on farm and in forest is increasing. By providing these clear definitions of activities and processes that can build adaptive capacity and resilience, the New Zealand Taxonomy intends to enable decision makers interested in allocating capital towards those activities or businesses. These criteria mean there are now more options for New Zealand Taxonomy alignment, which do not require emissions reductions. All activities under the adaptation and resilience criteria are classified as green. And we'll talk more in a second about what this might look like on farm and in forest. Next slide, please. And also just a reminder that the New Zealand taxonomy also has a strong focus on transition activities when it comes to the climate change mitigation criteria. This is in line with benchmark taxonomies, including Australia and Singapore. So the transition categories really aim to mobilise capital to support hard to abate sectors like aviation, steel and agriculture. We know that New Zealand needs targeted capital investment to ensure that farmers and foresters can transform their operations for lower emissions while still maintaining economic vitality. And having a transition category is designed to support this. The draft climate change mitigation criteria include definitions for measures such as purchasing of renewable energy generation and storage equipment, planting, adopting new technologies, and implementing new management practices that can help with this transition. Okay, next slide, please. Let's start out though with the new adaptation and resilience criteria. So I'd like to welcome to the webinar two members of our Ag and Forestry Technical Advisory Group. Professor Anita Reford is an applied economist based at Lincoln University, specialising in response to climate change in the primary sector. Professor Reford was an adaptation and resilience expert in our technical advisory group. We also have joining us today Lee Matheson. Lee's been working in agribusiness advisory for over 19 years and is currently Managing Director of Karen Ag. Lee was a member of the TAG throughout the development of both the mitigation and the adaptation and resilience criteria. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Jess.
Hi. So I wanted to start out at sort of the highest level and maybe ask you, Anita, what is adaptation and resilience and how is it relevant to New Zealand businesses?
Kia ora, thanks very much, Jess. So adaptation is really about how farmers, producers, growers, the wider sector can adjust their activities, their systems to cope with the impacts of a changing climate. So this might be very small sort of incremental tweaks to their systems through to investing in, kind of infrastructure, or right through to a more transformative change to their system. So it can be quite wide-ranging, but it's to ensure that their systems can continue to produce and thrive in this very different, more variable, extreme climate. And of course, this is important for everybody. It's important not only for the sector, but also New Zealand's economy, as well as our communities that work and live in that sector, and to produce food for our country and globally.
Thank you. And so why do you think that it's important that adaptation and resilience activities are classified by the New Zealand taxonomy?
Is that for me again?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Well, I think it's important so that investors have confidence that what they're investing in is actually going to lead to increased resilience. So we don't want investment in activities that might have unintended consequences or lead to perhaps greater greenhouse gas emissions or other trade-offs, perhaps with biodiversity loss or things like that. So by classifying them as something that is likely to achieve these goals, then it gives investors that confidence.
Thanks. And Lee, bringing you in here, what value do you see in classifying the adaptation and resilience activities under the taxonomy?
Yes. Well, I guess the big benefit from my perspective is that hopefully it's going to incentivise adoption by farmers and growers and foresters beyond business as usual. One of the big challenges that we have is that many of us don't really recognise fully that climate change is here until it smacks us across the face. And by that stage, the things that we could have been doing to try and get ahead of the curve and make ourselves better prepared for that are too late. Invariably, a lot of these adaptation and resilience things are by their very nature quite long. They take a long time to put in place. They can be very costly. And anything that we can do to effectively give investors confidence to put capital into these things, therefore lowering the cost of accessing that for farmers and growers, it's got to be a good thing.
And getting that really long-term kind of future thinking planning happening as well with what's available.
So,
Yeah. And so just trying to make it really practical for people when we're talking about adaptation and resilience activities, what does that actually mean for farmers and foresters? What would those things look like on farm and in forest?
well, I'll start. So, one of the big implications for the dairy industry with climate change is heat stress on cows. And, we spend a lot of time and effort often taking trees and other shade and shelter off our farm systems, and now we need to put them back. And of course, you can't just grow a tree in 2 years. So, looking forward to try and, increase the ability for cows to get shade and shelter on dairy farms, particularly those with irrigation, will be particularly important. That could be a really tangible example of what A&R activity might look like on the dairy system.
Yeah, awesome. I think that makes it really practical for people to see the sorts of activities. When we say adaptation and resilience, it can sound a little bit opaque, but that we're looking at practical things on farm and in forest that can help build that adaptive capacity and respond to the changing climate. Thank you both so much. I'm going to leave you there, but thank you for all your contributions as well in shaping the criteria so far. And I am going to hand over to Pip Band, who is from the Climate Bonds Initiative, who are the technical delivery partners for developing the criteria. And Pip is going to run us through what the adaptation and resilience criteria actually look like. So thanks so much, Lee and Anita.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Lee and Anita, for that overview. So as Jess said, I'm going to briefly talk today about the taxonomy's approach to adaptation and resilience, which is going out to consultation. So as with the mitigation taxonomy, there are 3 areas of the taxonomy that need to be considered. So the substantial criteria, that is the areas the activity demonstrates a substantial contribution to the objective. So in this case, adaptation and resilience. Then consideration to ensuring that this activity doesn't unintentionally lead to causing harm to other environmental objectives of the taxonomy. So that's the DNSH, or do no significant harm. And the third is that the entities consider alignment to the minimum social safeguards. So today I'll be focusing on the substantial criteria for adaptation and resilience, as the DNSH and MSS are the same as what was developed for mitigation, with the exception of the mitigation DNSH, as obviously we didn't need that previously. So as you can see in the box up on the right-hand side, A&R has 2 pathways. The first being process-based approach, which I'll talk you through, and also a sector whitelist, or a pre-approved list of activities that can be funded for the agriculture and forestry sector as the first sectors under the taxonomy. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I'll talk through the process-based approach firstly. So this approach was developed by the TEG, and they took the approach to start with a process developed by the EU, but obviously to adjust accordingly for New Zealand. And I should note, the EU process is a draft, it's not in the market. So what the process-based approach does is to set out how adaptation and resilience activities can be identified and designed for taxonomy alignment. So unlike mitigation, which has green and transition categories, all activities under adaptation and resilience are considered green under the New Zealand taxonomies. So whereas the whitelist has a range of one-off investment, the process-based approach is really suited to longer-term, larger-scale activities. So the process-based approach that's open for feedback during the consultation has several key areas of guidance provided. And I guess this is key. Its guidance was established by the TEG, and it has kind of gone beyond where the EU taxonomy landed, because it really wants to provide, I guess, guidance, but also flexibility and not lock it down in a rigid process. And in part, that's to recognise kind of the nascent landscape that in adaptation and resilience, and to allow flexibility of how users are going to use it. So the draft process includes the guidance on areas such as identifying physical climate hazards to the economic activity and assessing vulnerability and exposure, identifying those physical climate hazards, minimum emission scenario and suitable climate modelling. So this is something that the TEG spent considerable time on, looking at the approach for the minimum models. So they've landed on SSP 3 to 7.0 as the minimum emission scenario for the climate projections. and further guidance also provided on how you can localise that and use a range of different climate models to downscale, for example, using the NIWA downscale data. So other areas are scale and proportion of the risk assessments. Guidance is provided, relevant risk references for best practice methods, considering local regional contexts, as I said, using things like the NIWA downscaled data and maladaptation risks, as well as, importantly, alignment with iwi and local plans. Next slide, please. So the second part, as I said, so that's the process-based approach if you're looking at longer term examples. And I guess before I move on to that, just some examples of what that might look like in the process-based approach is in agriculture, which we're focused on at the moment, is things like breeding for heat-resistant livestock or establishing structures for shade for livestock. And then in other sectors, things like elevating or relocating roads and rail networks, or things like distributed and community energy projects in the energy sector. But as I mentioned, when we start to look at the whitelist, what we've got here is a list of automatically approved adaptation and resilience activities that have been identified as low risk for maladaptation. And also they've been pre-screened for do no significant harm and minimum social safeguards. So essentially they're a low risk option that people can choose from a shopping list, and they can filter by the climate hazards themselves or go through and give consideration to how that investment might be used within their entity. So it's really to provide a simplified point of entry compared to that full process-based approach, which, as I said, is for kind of longer term adaptation resilience activities. So obviously it needs to have an adaptation and resilience focus and recognition that in a lot of instances, what might be invested will also have co-benefits. So an example would be, say, GIS systems. In agriculture, you could clearly use that for adaptation resilience, but you could also use it for productivity and other benefits. So that is completely allowable under the framework, but there's obviously got to be an A&R focus in there. As I said, with the process-based, it's the same with the whitelist. All activities are classified as green. There's no distinction with transition. So some examples under the whitelist, and there's many for you to review through the consultation period, are things like early warning system investments, and there's a number of potential investments along those lines. GIS, as I mentioned, native ecosystem restoration. So the TEG and the TAG were very keen to ensure that nature-based solutions were really high up in the taxonomy, and also areas like emergency preparedness and response planning. Next slide, please. So the second consultation period, which Jess has talked to, but this is obviously the first time that the adaptation resilience criteria are available for feedback. And we're particularly seeking your feedback on, is the process-based approach right-sized and practical for New Zealand? So as I said, when we looked at what had been developed in the EU, I think there was some concern that without providing further guidance, that it didn't provide enough detail of how you could actually adopt that. So interested in what needs to be tweaked. Also, we've tried as much as we can to find local guidance documents to provide, I guess, further detail to entities, but any that we've missed, we would love to hear any other guidance that we could include to assist users of the taxonomy. And I guess most importantly, you know, what's missing? What activities are we missing, or any others that should be added to the whitelist? And I guess remembering, of course, with the whitelist that these need to be low risk. So it's not everything. They need to be, you know, pre-screened for do no significant harm, MSS, and have a low risk of maladaptation. I guess if they fall outside of those confines, that's what you would use the process-based approach for under the Adaptation and Resilience Taxonomy. So I think that's it, Jess. Next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Pip. So yes, that is our adaptation and resilience criteria, but obviously there's another set of criteria that you're all probably much more familiar with, which is our climate change mitigation criteria, which were available for consultation in June. And we received a really broad range of feedback. You can watch, there's a previous webinar for a summary of the feedback that was received. And there have been some pretty extensive revisions to those criteria, and they're now available to review and to feedback on in the second consultation. I'm just going to run you through quickly some of the high-level areas of change that have been made. So if we go on to the next slide. So there's been changes to the development of a transition whole of farm activity, and I'm actually going to talk about that one in detail next. But just summarizing some of the other areas of change. So there's been some activities that have been removed from the climate change mitigation criteria because they were deemed to not meet the bar of substantial emissions reductions. There's been attempts throughout the criteria to really clarify and streamline the use of farm environment plans in the criteria. The technical groups are very clear that the goal is to use verification measures that already exist or are already being undertaken as far as possible. So any further inputs on how to align with those processes that already exist in order for proponents to verify when they are undertaking activities in the taxonomy would be very helpful. There is now also a more streamlined approach to incorporating new technologies into the taxonomy as they come online. Again, that's really focused on aligning with existing frameworks and processes. There have been pretty extensive revisions to the forestry's definitions. Again, that's to really clarify and ensure that they're usable with existing frameworks and there's not confusion amongst different pieces of regulation and different frameworks definitions. There have been some additional protections added, both in the substantial contribution criteria, but also with the addition of two new do no significant harm criteria, one for emissions mitigation. Now that we have adaptation and resilience criteria, there needs to be a do no significant harm check against emissions, and one for land use change. There have also been some pretty substantial edits to the do no significant harm to build in resiliency and greater erosion protections, which were called for in the feedback. It's also been proposed in this consultation that we take a streamlined approach for do no significant harm and the minimum social safeguards, which would look like initially that they're initially optional for assessment against those criteria in a phased approach, and that when they do become required assessments, that there's an exclusion for small businesses when they come online. So in the consultation materials that you'll find online, there is a detailed summary of changes, as well as rationales for where changes may not have been made, despite feedback being received. So you can review that in much more detail, but that is some of the high-level areas where you can look for significant change. Next slide, please. So I do just want to talk in a little bit more detail about this whole of farm activity. So the whole of farm activity allows for a whole farm system to seek taxonomy alignment. Now, in general, taxonomies classify single activities that can be undertaken, economic activities, so that there's sort of a granular and very detailed level of assessment, but it was felt important in New Zealand to allow for a whole of farm assessment. So there is a green classification for the whole of farm activity, which has a very stringent emissions threshold. And that threshold deems where farms could be considered net zero aligned under the mitigation criteria. So just a reminder that the taxonomy uses the green label, defining green on achievement of specific environmental objectives. So all the climate change adaptation and resilience activities, as Pip said, are labelled green, but under the mitigation criteria, only net zero activities are labelled green, or assumed net zero activities are labelled green. But the TEG and the TAG felt it was really important to broaden taxonomy alignment for whole farm systems that could credibly show they were on a journey to lowering emissions at that whole of farm level. So CSF undertook direct consultation with agricultural industry bodies and key players to consider how to design this measure, and factoring in considerations like farming system variability, mixed farm systems, recognition of already high-performing farms, etc. And based on this, the TEG and the TAG have proposed an approach which you can see on screen here, or the start of on screen here, where proponents could either qualify by demonstrating that they are in the upper quartile of emissions intensity for their industry, or by demonstrating emissions reductions on a baseline. And there are a number of caveats on each of these, which you can review in the consultation materials, but that's the thrust of the two pathways. And we're putting this out for feedback for the first time in this consultation period. And so as a reminder, there is no requirement to seek whole of farm alignment. This is only really for the most ambitious proponents under the mitigation goal. And there are all of the transition measures still in existence in the criteria, which you can also seek taxonomy alignment for, or which sustainable finance could be available for. Okay, so next slide, please. The second public consultation. So it is open from today until October the 17th at 5 p.m. If you pop on, thank you. We're really keen to hear your views, obviously, on those new adaptation and resilience criteria. In the mitigation criteria, we're particularly interested in hearing views on areas where feedback was contested in the last consultation. So we had feedback in both directions on particular elements, or where new innovations have been developed, like that whole of farm activity. There is, of course, the option to provide us general feedback as well. We would really encourage you all to submit your views and have input on the outcome of the criteria. You can submit your feedback online. It can come either via the online form, which is really focused on those areas that I just outlined as important for the consultation, or you're also welcome to email the Secretariat with free-form responses, and the email address is there, but it's taxonomy@sustainablefinance.nz. CSF as the Secretariat is also available to speak with any organisation who would like clarifications, who want to ask questions about the process or the criteria, and also to take feedback verbally. So if you are interested in having a briefing and consultation call, you can reach out to that same email address, and we're really happy to set that up with you. So next slide, please. This is our very detailed timeline, but consultation, the second consultation you'll see there closes in October. And we'll have another public webinar then to summarise the feedback that we received, and then the TEG and the TAG with support from CBI will go into making the final revisions for the agricultural and forestry criteria, and we'll be looking to get those into market by the end of the year. Okay, and next slide, please. So, as I said earlier, last week, the Minister of Climate Change announced that we'll be developing criteria for the energy sector taxonomy next, and then we'll be moving on to construction and building. So if you go on to the next slide. Oh, can I? Yes, great. So we've opened an expressions of interest process on the CSF website for the formation of the new energy sector tag. Applications for that are open until October the 10th, and we will be announcing the new tag members or notifying the new tag members by October 24th. We're looking for people who have both of those first sets of expertise, so expertise in climate change mitigation and or adaptation and resilience, and energy sector knowledge. And then at least one of these other categories. So you might come from financial services, from science, policy and regulation, from human rights and supply chain risk, or from Indigenous rights and interests. So we're looking for those top two and then at least one of the others. And some details about the commitment is on the right-hand side there, but there's a lot more detail if you go to the CSF website and have a look at the tag expressions of interest page. Please also share this with folks that you think would be appropriate to join. It's an opportunity to really help shape the technical aspects of this sector's criteria and ensure that they are relevant and impactful and practical in the New Zealand context. Okay, that is us for today. So ngā mihi. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to receiving your feedback in the public consultation period.